Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Zenergy Podcast. I'm your host, Karan. In this episode, I sit down with Derrick Flakoll, Senior Policy Associate at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, to unpack one of the most important developments in clean energy policy right now, the Tax Reconciliation Bill, often also referred to as the Big Beautiful Bill. This was recorded just before the Senate released its latest draft, but Derrick's breakdown of the House version still offers a timely and useful foundation. Things are shifting very quickly. Whether you're a developer, investor, or just trying to follow climate policy, this episode provides key context on how we got here and what might happen next. Derrick explains the proposed changes to IRA provisions, shares his predictions for how this could ultimately play out, and offers insight into what experts and insiders in the space are saying. If you'd like to go deeper, his full analysis is on BloombergNEF. I hope you enjoy this timely conversation with Derrick Flakoll. Derrick, welcome to the Zenergy Podcast. Thank you again for taking the time. Really excited to have you on and looking forward to diving into the Tax Reconciliation Bill that's currently in the Senate. You wrote a very interesting analysis on this bill, and excited to dive in to some of that analysis. But before getting to that, where have we seen the greatest successes on the implementation side of the IRA? And conversely, where has momentum stalled or fallen short, do you feel?
Well, I think it depends on sort of which elements of the bill you're looking at. If you are looking at sort of investment, particularly in more mature sectors like clean power, wind, solar, storage, you've seen quite a lot of change there. There's been a pretty big increase in installed capacity, and you've also seen a lot of factory announcements that are associated with that. Now, it's important to clarify two things. One, there's this classic logical fallacy called post hoc ergo propter hoc, after this, therefore because of this. And so it's important to note there's a lot of other factors going into these sorts of booms and installation and in factories. Things are getting cheaper. There's broader concern about reshoring. And it's also important to note that when it comes to announcements, that doesn't always translate into what we call a final investment decision, right? Sometimes these things we're always going to sort of fall off the vine because loans got more expensive or they weren't able to get the right parts. And obviously other forms of uncertainty have sort of contributed to some of those getting canceled. I think the number I've seen from C2ES, another climate energy think tank, is about $14 billion in cancellations this year. So obviously some of this stuff was on somewhat uncertain ground. Nevertheless, we've seen big growth in installation, and I think big growth in reported and intended factory installations. The vast majority of that spending, by the way, has been in the battery space because that plays into electric vehicles as well as the grid. And there are some pretty generous subsidies and strict restrictions on those subsidies for electric vehicles that really strongly incentivize building parts of that automotive battery supply chain in North America in general, and the US in particular. Now, we've seen a little bit less progress in some emerging technology areas, particularly hydrogen and carbon capture, where the market has been waiting on newer and clearer rules. At the end of the day, when you pass a bill, usually the implementing agency, in this case, in most cases, the Internal Revenue Service, the tax agency, has to provide guidance on how you actually prove that you're complying, how you calculate the credit, and so forth. And so for hydrogen, the 45V clean hydrogen tax credit that subsidized that kind of production was entirely new, and we didn't really see final rules on that until the very end of Biden's term at the very beginning of this year. And similarly, while the 45Q carbon capture tax credit previously existed, it was substantially changed by the Inflation Reduction Act, and we haven't really seen a lot more clarity on what those changes mean in practice. There wasn't a lot of guidance that was put out. And so similarly, investments in those factories, which are like really big, really expensive industrial facilities, haven't budged as much. and other things like, for example, the greenhouse gas reduction fund that I mentioned earlier were so early, like it took so long to develop them, that a lot of that capital hasn't been given out yet. When it comes to the loan programs, off some of their investments in factories or in innovative clean energy facilities, or like clean industrial facilities rather, a lot of those loan guarantees only ended up closing in the final days of the Biden administration after the election. Those then got hit with somewhat unexpected, a little bit beyond precedent funding freezes and pauses under the Trump administration. So a lot of that stuff is still working its way through the courts, and we're waiting to see how much of that gets released and for what projects. We've already seen some funding released for nuclear projects in the biofuels refinery, and certainly the Trump administration has made clear that some areas like geothermal, critical minerals, and nuclear in particular, as well as possibly transmission, are a bit bipartisan and might see funding ultimately go through. Similarly, there was a big set of grants called the Industrial Demonstrations Program, focused on primarily decarbonizing various kinds of manufacturing, steel, petrochemicals, and so forth. The metals grants are some of the few that really survived a recent Trump administration attempt to cancel or claw back a lot of those grants. Things touching concrete, petrochemicals, and so forth, carbon capture, were not spared. Those were not spared. So I think there's a lot to be said about how long it takes to roll out grants and develop regulatory guidance. The interagency processes, that combine Department of Energy, the Department of the Treasury, and the IRS, those are things that inevitably take time to do. But with particular projects, getting their capital together, closing a loan, or getting an industrial demonstrations grant, permitting and other sort of bureaucratic challenges really slowed down the implementation of that. And that, I think, speaks to the problems with what the bill is trying to achieve, right? It wants a just transition, something that's good for labor, good for local communities, and wants to consult those communities, and fairly. And it's not clear how much it's bureaucratic processes and how much it's those kinds of sort of extra goals that were resulting in some of that lack of speed. But I can tell you it certainly wasn't for lack of effort or focus. It's just that things are hard and they're slow. And ultimately, we're going to have to see what has durable bipartisan support, policy-wise and politically, to get things to the very end of that finish line.
Clearly, as the listeners can surely tell, there's just so much included in the Inflation Reduction Act, so many different pieces to parcel out, so much which requires a lot of coordination, as you mentioned, across many different interagencies, and also long lead times, because some of these projects, for example, on the manufacturing side especially, but also across other verticals, just take so much capital and also a lot of permitting at the local, state, and federal level. So some of this delay is unavoidable, but then maybe there's also a big portion of it that could have been streamlined potentially. It's hard to say. Like Jennifer Granholm said yesterday at the Politico Energy Summit, which I know you were also at, she sort of wished, in a sense, in hindsight, that this bill was passed in year one of Biden's term to provide a little additional time for some of these larger scale investments to manifest on the ground. But would love to hear your sense on any additional takeaways that you feel could be drawn from what we saw in the past couple of years with the IRA, and then would like to transition more to the current state of things. But I think understanding the IRA provides a really important foundation for now what we're seeing with regards to the budget reconciliation package.
Sure. I mean, I think you sort of implied a pretty good point there about the changing macroeconomic conditions as the IRA was rolled out, right? The reason it's called the Inflation Reduction Act is that, Joe Manchin, who is the 50th vote in the Senate that got them to the tiebreaker that Kamala Harris broke as vice president, he really wanted to refocus it on dealing with energy costs and competitiveness. And that was a long negotiation, and it took place in the backdrop of rising inflation. And then rising inflation led to the Federal Reserve hiking interest rates after this bill was passed. And so the politics were difficult, and that delayed it. And then that put that into a vulnerable place as the underlying economics changed. And just as a reminder for our audience, these projects are almost entirely capital expenditure, not as much operating expenditure, right? It's all about the amount of money you can get up front. And that means that finance and interest rates are super important to understand. In other words, what this really illustrates is the wisdom of the classic philosopher Mike Tyson. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? And policymaking, especially for something as long-term, rapidly changing and chaotic as climate change, has to be durable to changing economics and changing politics underneath. That can create new opportunities, but it also creates new risks.
Got it. Yeah, no, I love that quote. It's such a pertinent quote. And it sort of, in a way, segues nicely to what's happening currently, where a lot of people didn't expect many of these provisions to be at risk of repeal, at least to the extent that we're seeing them being right now. So could you provide a little bit? You released a really nice analysis dissecting what that House sent over to the Senate in their reconciliation package. Could you just provide a little bit of an overview of what are some of the major changes that they're attempting to make?
Happily. So just as a reminder for your audience, budget reconciliation is a special thing that Congress can do if they want to pass a bill by a simple majority without having to worry about a 60 vote threshold in the Senate. Otherwise, you could get filibustered. So they can make changes to spending. Mostly, they would like to fund a continuation of Trump's tax cuts from his first term, as well as a few new promises. And so the Inflation Reduction Act was seen as a sort of prime source of cuts for that. But at the same time, overwhelmingly investment in these clean technology factories and in these power plants has gone to Republican states and districts. So it's a little bit politically tricky to cut the credits completely, especially because a lot of businesses have planned investments on the basis of those credits. And it takes time to build these things. And so there's a lot of discussion about creating a bit of a glide path for these existing projects to get finished with the incentives still in place. That said, there's also a fiscally conservative faction in the House that wants as many cuts as possible. There's concern about whether these credits pick winners. And so they went for a sort of compromise that is more like full repeal than it initially looked like. So first of all, the credits phase out earlier. One other innovation from the Inflation Reduction Act is that with the clean power credits, they effectively stayed in place indefinitely until the US power system as a whole was emitting only about 1/4 of its carbon emissions or carbon equivalent emissions that it had in 2022. So in effect, those would have stayed in place until the late 2030s or early 2040s. Now, there are much earlier phase out dates towards the end of the 2020s, but there's actually three major tweaks that make this closer to a full cut than you would initially think. So first of all, even before the credits are fully phased out, what's called tax credit transferability ends. As mentioned, that allows new projects that couldn't otherwise get the full benefit or close to the full benefit of those tax subsidies to claim them. If you get rid of tax credit transferability, you really limit the ability of these projects to benefit from subsidies. You sort of shrink the number of companies and banks that are willing to lend to them, and you just make financing much harder and more expensive. Secondly, there's a really subtle change to the way that projects qualify for the tax credits. First of all, there is historically what's called a beginning of construction deadline. So if the tax credits say end in 2032, that means that you have to begin construction of the project by the end of 2032. And the way the IRS defines that is by putting 5% of your overall expected spending or capital expenditure down, right? Committing it in a contract. So that's actually a fairly generous interpretation that could allow projects to say enter service, that is connect to the grid or start producing things in like 2035, for example, to still qualify as long as they began construction earlier. So the final House bill makes two changes to this. First of all, it actually creates a beginning of construction deadline that is 60 days after the bill is ultimately signed by the president. So that's a pretty narrow window, right? If you are able to get your money out the door that quickly, which a lot of developers probably will be able to, but not all will, that just creates a cutoff that's going to eliminate a lot of projects. And then secondly, the projects have to enter service. That is to say, they have to be actually working by the end of 2028. And lastly, there's some restrictions on suppliers and supply chains. There's particularly restrictions on what's called material assistance, a really broad definition that includes intellectual property, even a single part sale from so-called foreign entities of concern, which includes the governments or companies or individuals from Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China. China is, of course, by far the most hard to avoid of those, with like really dominant positions in battery and critical mineral supply chains, solar, and so forth. And so effectively, if you didn't have this really tight restriction on when you have to start building the power plants, you would still get a foreign entity of concern restriction coming in about a year after the signing of the bill that would really tightly restrict availability of the credits. Like very few businesses would be able to claim them as long as those foreign entity of concern material assistance provisions are in place. One quick addendum. I do want to note that the transferability limits are not effective for the main clean power credits in the latest House version of the bill, but they still remain in place for a few other credits like those relating to biofuels or clean technology manufacturing. So it's a whole obstacle course of barriers, which effectively makes it pretty hard for a lot of projects to claim these, particularly after 2028.
Yeah, and we're gonna do our best to dive into each of these to parcel them out for the audience to get a better sense of how they'll actually be impacting projects. We'd love to start with the FIAC provisions because yesterday the NextEra CEO I thought said something very interesting that I initially wasn't super aware of until he had mentioned it, where on the material assistance claims, even one screw that could potentially be derived from like a China, for example, on a project that's massive could hinder a company like NextEra on that project from receiving the tax credits, which just provides so much uncertainty in terms of what actually would be in the FIAC provisions versus what wouldn't. And the way he's describing it was it essentially makes all of these projects unbankable because there's not a lot of clarity on what is included in that material assistance piece. Like if a screw is included, which they might not even know upfront whether, because it's five, some of these items are 5 supply chain pieces down. So it's like nearly impossible to really assess whether a screw that is 5 layers down in the supply chain, like where it's coming from, making it just very vague and uncertain whether almost all of these projects in that specific sense would be able to receive a tax credit.
Yeah, I mean, these provisions have been widely called unworkable. We certainly think that they would prove a major restriction on new projects. It's very vaguely defined, so it would be really dependent on legal interpretations from the Treasury, from the IRS, for those to become usable at all, and that can often take up to 2 years. So by that time, of course, a lot of projects just would simply be out of the money. There would be like a pretty big slowdown in investment.
And another comment that stuck out to me by the CEO of Zenergy Capital Partners, which is a very large private equity firm in this space, was how essentially financial actors, what they value above all else largely is certainty. And what the IRA did was provide a 10-year window, creating the rules of the game, essentially giving capital allocators insight into what their relative returns could be during this window. However, now, 2 years later, a lot of this is effectively being repealed, at least in the bill as it stands. And he's mentioning what the insight was for me was when he said that as a capital allocator, if you change the rules now, not only does it remove our confidence in this specific sector, but it essentially eliminates our confidence that in other bills that the government puts forward, because then we'll always have in the back of the mind that the government will just come in a couple years later and again like completely eliminate what the expectation was from the outset, which I thought was a really interesting point because initially I was mostly looking at it as the impact on this sector, but it seems well beyond that.
Yeah, I think this is a thing you've heard a lot of Republican legislators point out themselves, right? Brett Guthrie, the chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, has been at a few events in the last 2 days, and he's frequently pointed out that there are genuine issues with a whipsawing of energy policy between, Obama, Trump 1, Biden, and now Trump 2. That said, the devil's always in the details, and where you choose to draw the line matters, right? I mean, pretty much the entire set of Republicans in the House did vote for radical change in energy policy because they have other legislative priorities, including, for example, returning immediate depreciation on all capital expenditures, right? Which would benefit renewables among other sectors, but they consider that a higher priority. They consider extending individual tax cuts a higher priority. And so they don't necessarily want to create this instability, but at the end of the day, every party is going to trade off instability and what that means for the market with their own policy vision. That said, you've certainly heard a lot of calls in the last few weeks about a sort of bipartisan convergence on national priorities, right? We're seeing massive projected growth in energy demand from data centers. BNEF's projections are somewhat somewhat more conservative, actually, than a lot of other players. But we still see data center demand doubling within, up until 2030, and that's very chunky demand, right? It basically never turns off for economic reasons. And that means the peak energy demand in the evening when it's, everybody's home and it's hot and they're cooking dinner, that's going to go up. And you're going to need to grow the energy system to provide for that, to say nothing of other priorities like manufacturing, like keeping the lights on when it's hot and everybody's turning on their air conditioning, which is going to become more common due to climate change. So there is a lot of common interest in keeping energy prices low and keeping supply wide and reliable. And as the NextEra CEO pointed out at that Politico Energy Summit, renewables are actually some of the fastest energy sources that can come online, and storage as well. In a recent data center outlook we realized that because speed to power is the biggest priority a lot of these data centers are looking for, you sort of compare the construction timelines for different energy sources. And in most power markets across the US, in most cases, wind, solar, and storage are actually considerably faster to build than gas plants, which are in such high demand because they are dispatchable. They can provide some more reliable power. Those are seeing backlogs out to 2032. A lot of developers just can't get their hands on them. They're going to be more expensive to build when they are built. And so having renewables as a key part of the mix that keeps prices lower and can get built faster is in basically everybody's interests. But the question is, will enough be deployed without this existing framework and without these subsidies? We've done some projections on this where we find that on net, you'd probably see about 11% lower construction through 2035 of wind, solar, and storage combined in terms of capacity. And that might not sound like much, but think about if your income went down 11% when you just had a bunch of really expensive bills coming due. And that's kind of the situation that the American ratepayer and the American taxpayer would be facing. So at the end of the day, you could see, and we have seen a few figures in the Senate, like Senator John Curtis, Senator Lisa Murkowski, Senator Shelley Moore Capito, point out they're concerned about destabilizing the energy system and the energy market, just as all of these urgent demands are coming onto the system. You might end up seeing a sort of rescue attempt coming in the Senate for that reason. At the same time, though, we saw 12 Republicans in the House argue that the changes in the original House version of the bill to the energy credits were too extreme. And then those changes got more extreme because 5 fiscal conservatives in the Freedom Caucus in the House wanted those. And then ultimately everybody voted for the bill. So we're facing an uncertain landscape where these potential future risks and these common interests might not be enough to overcome the intense pressure to cut costs, push the bill forward, and get something done. And so we do face an uncertain environment.
A lot of thoughts were popping into my head as you were speaking. And I do want to ask for your prediction, or at least your best guess, in terms of what you feel will ultimately happen to the bill. I know there's a lot of uncertainty on this front, but before getting to that, one question that came to mind was when you were mentioning how we're expecting an 11% decline in renewable generation by 2035, which when you mentioned that, I actually also thought, wow, that's less than I would have initially expected. But then when you made that income comparison, did concretize it a little. But still, I feel as if 11% given a 30% tax credit repeal is still sort of less of an impact than I would expect, since a lot of these projects operate on relatively thin margins. So I would assume that a 30% tax credit repeal would have a pretty sizable impact. Could you speak to what would be some of the main drivers for why the renewable generation will still persist?
Sure. So there's a few different elements to consider, and this gets to some of the key assumptions in our projections. So a lot of what we find is that assuming that developers can qualify for the beginning of construction deadline in 60 days, which is a tight window, then they have basically 4 years to complete their projects. And as a result, you see a lot of development kind of pulled forward that might have happened after 2028 anyway. If, however, there's a change in enforcement standards from the Trump administration that makes it harder to qualify for that deadline in practice, then you might see a considerably bigger issue in build. Second of all, this is an 11% decline in capacity, not generation. So that's a really important distinction. Capacity does not equate to the actual amount of generation. And there's differential impacts, right? So solar, which typically has a capacity factor in the 20s, like the rated capacity results in about 1/5 of that as generation, is rather more resilient. Storage too, you see declines, I think, of about less than 10% for each of those two categories. Wind, however, which is really expensive, really capital intensive, it does operate on thin margins, as you said, that is more affected, and you see considerably larger declines there. Offshore wind is particularly affected. And because those have larger capacity factors, they generate more power. That actually has a disproportionate impact on the grid. But I would also point out there are certain there are certain economic and non-economic reasons to believe that renewable build will be robust in many markets. First of all, as I mentioned, it's often the fastest thing you can put online in a fair number of markets, right? Most places outside what's called MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, that's basically the Midwest and some of the South. It's also often cheaper than other sources. And if you have state level regulators, public utility commissions who are dedicated to keeping costs low, they'll probably ask for that to be a big part of the build mix. Now, to be clear, this is even incorporating certain levels of tariffs that are currently in place. Those could change. They have changed. They might get higher. They might get lower. And that's another key variable that could really change this. Third of all, it doesn't necessarily account for the potential effects of supply chain disruptions due to tariffs and related negotiations. We saw there were major disruptions for rare earth permanent magnets recently because of trade disputes between the US and China. That could really affect certain forms of offshore wind build, for example. And lastly, a key point that we'd like to make is that this is also assuming that renewable portfolio standards and other state level preferences for renewables remain in place. And that there's no major regulatory barriers from states like Texas, which have been considering things that would have really hurt the economics of not only new, but even existing renewables and storage projects. So as long as you have those sorts of policy pushes, there's a bit of demand that's pretty guaranteed. And even in markets like Texas, where there are no preferences, the market is set up such that it really rewards those renewables and storage projects. But ultimately, these things are moving targets, right? They could change. And there's certainly a little bit less emphasis on renewables and decarbonization as opposed to other elements. Still, many things like speed and cost still push in the direction of renewables deployment.
Appreciate you expanding on that. Another insight that I recently read regarding the speed to cost metric that you just said is extremely important, especially for what they call the hyperscalers, the Microsofts, the Amazon, which have allocated a significant amount of capital to building out these data centers, many designed for AI purposes, don't necessarily care as much about cost as they do speed. I mean, of course, cost is an important component, but also at the same time, they have these climate commitments that they really still want to stick to. So, like the Microsoft deal recently with Constellation to turn on one of the nuclear plants wasn't even to provide direct electricity to data center. Instead, which I think got lost in the fold, it was essentially a power purchase agreement so Microsoft could buy clean power and help meet some of their net zero goals. So I think that's just something that gets lost in the fold, which I wanted to highlight. And then another point where you were mentioning how we expect a lot of demand to be coming on, but we're also seeing a lot of these power plants going offline. So like on one hand, design or demand's going up and then supplies going down, which is another big part of the equation for why we need so much new generation over the coming years. I think they're around like 115 gigawatts set to come offline due to market factors, not because of many other factors. Some of that can still be brought or kept online, but a lot of it is scheduled to go off.
Yeah, well, we might see some changes in that regards from the Trump administration has been trying to use emergency orders to keep certain plants online where they feel there's reliability concerns over the summer. We'll see how long those last. Certainly, there might be some legal questions there. There's often cost questions because these are often relatively uneconomic sources of power. Nonetheless, in our projections for that 11% renewables cut for the next 10 years, we do try and account both for the fact that there is going to be longer life and more use of existing, coal and gas power plants, and also that there are quite serious supply and cost constraints associated with building new gas generation, although utilities certainly want to and are planning to get permission to build those as well. So it's a complicated picture and one that's going to change, but not all of that planned shutdown is going to be delayed forever. And that is going to require new capacity online, and it's going to require moves to keep the grid as a whole at a system level resilient, stable, dispatchable. So that's going to mean more storage where that's properly compensated by markets. That's probably going to mean, as we said, a little bit of a longer lifespan for existing technologies and dispatchable power. And the hyperscalers are trying their best to make sure that includes nuclear and potentially some new dispatchable clean power like geothermal, although a lot of that stuff is pretty early stage at this point.
Okay, the moment we've all been waiting for. What is Derrick's prediction for what will happen in the Senate to the reconciliation bill?
Right. Well, I mean, this is ultimately a best guess thing, right? I think we'll see something that is similar to the House version in that it is not an explicit repeal, but it does add new restrictions earlier, and it does involve a definite end date to the tax credits. Ultimately, it's going to include some kind of foreign entity of concern provision. One thing that really unites the Republican Party and also many members of the Democratic Party is concern about excessive reliance on Chinese supply chains. Although realistically, it's kind of hard to avoid all Chinese suppliers and intellectual property. And in fact, if the U.S. wanted to scale up its own industries, it would probably be a good idea to selectively engage with those sort of industry leaders, many of which are based in China, as well as countries and allies and partners like Japan and South Korea, which are often leading firms there as well. But although, to be clear, BNEF doesn't offer policy advice. This is just a sort of technical assessment. In addition, you are probably going to see some earlier kind of phase out date that may or may not involve a shift back to a beginning of construction date rather than placed in service. It's also not clear whether these restrictions on transferability will ultimately remain in place or be rolled back. You're You've also seen quite a few carve-outs for nuclear power and for geothermal. Energy Secretary Chris Wright has championed that. And I suspect that something like that will probably stay in place. There's been a lot less active discussion of what happens with tax credits for electric vehicles or for home solar and storage. In general, I think those are a little bit more caught up in culture war issues. They're seen as primarily benefiting upper income consumers. And so for populist reasons as well as cost ones, those might be more likely to fall out. Something that was surprising was the House version of the bill phased out clean hydrogen tax credits very quickly by the end of 2025, in part, I think, because not many projects got up to speed. And it was seen as a lot of money in the budget bill for relatively little industry and few jobs. That said, I think the Senate is a little bit more invested in that credit. You've also seen some favorable regulatory changes from the Trump administration that might allow more projects, particularly in the oil and gas sector, to take advantage of those clean hydrogen credits. And so that might end up coming back into the fold as well. There's fairly favorable treatment of biofuels in the House bill, and I expect that will remain and possibly be made even more favorable, for example, by keeping transferability for those credits for longer. But ultimately, the stated positions of these senators are one thing. What they're willing and able to fight for is another. And where that lands in a negotiation between them and the House is a third factor entirely. And in a whirlwind policy environment that we've seen since Trump's return to office, we've seen that things from tariff rates to macroeconomic expectations to the top priorities of the party and its leadership can change within a moment. And so, as the last cliche I'll quote here, of the many I've quoted in this session, goes, predictions are hard, especially about the future. So we'll just have to see what happens.
Amazing. Derrick, thank you so much for taking the time to participate in the podcast, and really grateful for you to share your insights, and thank you for your service, keeping us all informed. We really appreciate it. And like you said, predictions are tough, so we'll just have to wait and see what happens. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much, Karan. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks so much for checking out the Zenergy Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate and subscribe to the podcast. It would mean so much to me and the rest of the team. We release episodes every Thursday, so stay tuned for all new episodes featuring industry leaders building a cleaner, greener future for us all. See you next time.